The silver watch lay face up in the mud, its rhythmic ticking a stark contradiction to the chaos of the storm that had just passed. It was the only sound in the unnatural quiet where a man's shouts used to be. This watch belonged to Silas Ward, the most feared overseer in Chatham County, and its owner was nowhere to be found. The man who was last seen with him, an enslaved man named Nathan Harris, had vanished into the pines, leaving behind only footprints that led to nowhere and a legend that would haunt the woods for generations. But what really happened on that stormy night in 1851? The truth was far more complex than a simple escape, and it began with a promise whispered in the dark. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Our story begins under the oppressive Georgia sun on a rice plantation where hope was a dangerous currency. The air on the Thompson plantation was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket woven from the cloying sweetness of decay rising from the flooded paddies, the sharp tang of human sweat, and the thick, humid breath of the Savannah River Delta. It was an air thick with fear, a permanent haze that clung to the skin and settled deep in the lungs. The world was a dizzying expanse of green, the endless rows of rice shoots shimmering under a sun that bleached the sky to a pale, merciless white. For the men and women who toiled in the muck, their backs bent from dawn until dusk, this world was a silent, grinding engine of labor. And its most fearsome component was Silas Ward. Nathan Harris moved through this world with a deliberate grace that was almost defiant. Years of hauling, digging, and cutting had forged his body into a formidable instrument of muscle and bone, but it was his stillness that set him apart. He was a quiet man, his face a carefully guarded mask, but his eyes missed nothing. They were the color of dark, wet earth, and in their depths, a keen intelligence watched, measured, and recorded everything, a guarded flame of defiance that no amount of hardship had yet managed to extinguish. He survived the days by building a fortress inside his own mind. While his body performed the grueling, repetitive motions of the work, his thoughts would drift, not to dreams of a future he couldn't afford to imagine, but to the intricate patterns of the world around him. He studied the way the water spiders danced on the surface of the paddy water, the precise geometry of a hawk's spiraling ascent, the subtle language of the wind as it whispered through the long-leaf pines that bordered the fields. He learned the land not as his prison but as a text, full of secrets and possibilities. Silas Ward was the master of this prison. He was not a monster of pure, mindless rage. His cruelty was far more terrifying for its methodical and personal nature. He was a man of medium height, his face a pale, sweat-sheened canvas under the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, his lips perpetually drawn into a thin, dismissive line. He carried his leather whip not as a tool to be used, but as a natural extension of his arm, its weight a constant, menacing presence. His true symbol of power, however, was the silver pocket watch he kept tethered to his vest. It was a gift from Master Thompson, a gleaming, intricate device that Ward consulted with obsessive frequency. He would snap it open, his thumb tracing the polished casing, and the soft click would echo across the fields, a sound that signaled his absolute dominion over their time, their labor, their very lives. The ticking of that watch was the rhythm of their suffering, each second a drop of their life force spent for another man's profit. On this particular afternoon, the heat was at its most brutal. The air shimmered, and the only sound besides the squelch of feet in mud was the drone of cicadas. Ward's gaze, sweeping across the bent back, snagged on a young boy named Daniel, no older than 12, who had stumbled, his small frame trembling with exhaustion. Ward was on him in an instant. He didn't shout, not at first. He simply stood over the boy, his shadow a suffocating presence. He snapped open the watch. "This watch," he said, his voice low and venomous, "tells me how much work a man owes. It tells me this field should be half done by now. And you, boy, you are behind schedule." The punishment was slow, a calculated lesson in pain designed for an audience. Nathan watched from 50 feet away, his jaw so tight his teeth ached. He continued his work, the rhythmic swing of his scythe unbroken, but inside him something cold and hard was taking shape. His gaze flicked to the boy's mother working in the next row, her face a stone mask of anguish. He met her eyes for a fraction of a second, and in that silent, shared glance, a promise passed between them, a vow of shared grief and an anger that was reaching its breaking point. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, a change came over the air. The oppressive heat did not lessen, but grew heavier, more electric. The birds in the distant cypress trees grew agitated, their calls sharp and frantic. A strange greenish tint colored the towering thunderheads that were massing on the horizon. The wind, which had been still all day, began to stir, rustling the Spanish moss that hung from the ancient oaks like the tattered shrouds of ghosts. The enslaved people felt the shift not just in the weather, but in the very atmosphere of the plantation. It was a premonition, a crack in the monotonous rhythm of their existence. In the sparse collection of cabins that made up the quarters, whispers replaced the usual weary silence. They spoke of the coming storm with a mixture of fear and a strange, unspoken anticipation. Ilara, an older woman whose eyes held the wisdom of generations and whose hands knew the secrets of roots and herbs, sat on the steps of her cabin, her gaze fixed on Nathan as he passed. She didn't speak to the others, but as he drew near, her low voice cut through the rising wind. "The sky is opening up tonight, Nathan," she said, her words more a prophecy than a statement. "A good night for debts to be paid and for the earth to wash things clean." Nathan merely nodded, his expression unreadable, but he felt the weight of her words settle upon him. He moved to his own small corner of a shared cabin, and while others secured loose shutters and brought in firewood, Nathan's preparations were of a different sort. From a loose floorboard he retrieved a small hidden bundle. Inside was a piece of sharp flint, a dried gourd stoppered with a corncob perfect for carrying water, and a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. It was a memento from his father, a man who had spoken of a life beyond the rice fields. Securing the items in a small pouch, Nathan's movements were calm and precise, the actions of a man whose plan had been waiting a long, long time for the right moment to be born. The storm broke with a sudden biblical fury. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid wind-driven sheets that turned the world to a churning gray blur. Thunder cracked directly overhead. a sound so violent it seemed to split the very foundations of the earth, and lightning followed in blinding, instantaneous flashes. In the main house, Silas Ward was drunk, his rage stoked by the storm and the discovery that a tool shed door had been left unlatched, its contents exposed to the deluge. He stormed out into the maelstrom, his fury settling on the first person he saw, Nathan, who was checking the lashings on a cabin roof. Ward's shouts were swallowed by the wind as he grabbed Nathan by the arm, dragging him out into the open towards the muddy track that led to the pinewoods. From a nearby cabin, a young woman peered through a crack in the wall, her heart pounding. In the strobing, epileptic flashes of lightning, she saw a chaotic tableau, two figures, one large and one larger, locked in a desperate struggle at the edge of the woods. She saw the glint of something metal, the wild swing of an arm, the spray of mud as they slipped and fell. Then the world would plunge back into roaring darkness. The shouting, which had been a faint, intermittent thread of human rage against the storm's symphony, suddenly stopped. The woman held her breath, her eye pressed to the crack. Another flash of lightning bleached the scene white, illuminating the lashing trees, the rain-pocked mud of the road, and the dark, gaping maw of the pinewoods. The road was empty. The two men were gone. There was only the wind, the thunder, and the relentless driving rain. The next morning rose on a world washed clean, the air fresh and cool, the sky a brilliant cloudless blue. The new day brought with it a stillness that was even more unsettling than the storm's fury. It was in this profound quiet that the new overseer, a nervous man named Peters sent from the main house, made the discovery. There, half sunk in the thick red mud of the road, lay Silas Ward's silver pocket watch. The glass face was miraculously unbroken, its polished surface reflecting the morning sun. And from it impossibly came a sound, unnaturally loud in the morning calm, a steady mechanical rhythm that seemed to mock the silence of the world around it. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was the only trace of Silas Ward. A search of the area revealed two sets of footprints. One set from the heavy hobnailed boots of an overseer, and the other, the deep impressions of Nathan's bare feet. The tracks led from the road directly towards the woods, clear and distinct in the soft mud. But 100 yards in, just as they entered the deep shadow of the pines, they became muddled, confused, and then they simply vanished, as if the men who made them had been lifted clean from the face of the earth. The news of the overseer's disappearance and the discovery of his ticking watch spread through the main house like a fever. Master Thompson, a man whose emotions were governed by the cold arithmetic of profit and loss, did not mourn Silas Ward. He raged against the disruption. He stood in his study, the morning light illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, his face a mask of thunderous fury. His wife, a frail woman named Catherine, who drifted through the house like a ghost in silk, wrung her hands by the window. "It's the atmosphere, William," she whispered, her voice thin and reedy. "The air feels cursed. The servants are spooked. It's an ill omen." Thompson slammed his fist on his mahogany desk, rattling a porcelain inkwell. "Omen? The only ill omen I see is the loss of a prime field hand and the cost of replacing a competent overseer. This isn't about curses, Catherine, it's about property. Nathan is my property. Ward, in his own way, was my property. This is theft, and I will see it answered for." He strode to the door, his voice booming through the halls as he summoned his house manager. "Get word out," he commanded. "I want a hunting party assembled before noon. Spread the word to every tracker and dog man in the county. $200 in gold for the man who brings Nathan Harris back. Dead or alive, I don't care which, so long as it's a swift and brutal resolution." The sum was substantial, enough to ensure that the hungriest and most ruthless men would answer the call. By midday, a rough collection of them had gathered in the plantation yard. They were lean, hard-bitten men with sun-scorched faces and eyes that held a casual cruelty. Their dogs, a mix of hounds and curs, whined and strained at their leashes, their hot breath misting in the cool morning air. Their leader was a man named Jebediah, a tracker with a near-mythical reputation for his relentlessness. He was tall and gaunt, with a long, drooping mustache and eyes the color of faded denim. He listened to Master Thompson's tirade with a quiet confidence, occasionally spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Don't you worry none, Master Thompson," Jebediah said, his voice a low drawl that carried an absolute certainty. "Ain't a man alive my dogs can't find. Storm or no storm, he left a scent. We'll have your boy back in chains before sundown." His men grunted in agreement, their talk coarse and boastful as they checked their rifles and filled their flasks. To them, this was not a mystery. It was a simple job of work, a matter of tracking a frightened animal and collecting their pay. The hunt began with an air of grim confidence. The dogs, given the scent from a piece of Nathan's discarded work shirt, surged forward, their bays echoing through the unnaturally quiet morning. Jebediah and his men followed, their boots squelching in the thick mud, the smell of damp earth and crushed pine needles sharp in the air. The trail was easy to follow at first, a clear path of deep, bare footprints alongside the heavier tread of Ward's boots, leading directly from the road into the dense wall of the pinewoods. The hunters moved quickly, their initial bravado seeming justified. "He's running scared," one of the men laughed, "just plunging straight ahead with no thought to where he's going." Jebediah didn't answer, his eyes scanning the ground, the trees, the sky. He had tracked dozens of runaways, and this felt different. There was a stillness in these woods that felt watchful, ancient. The trail continued for 100 yards, a straight, unwavering line into the deepening gloom of the forest. And then it stopped. It did not deviate. It did not scatter. It simply ceased to exist. One moment the prints were deep and clear in a patch of soft, damp earth. The next, there was nothing but undisturbed pine straw and fallen leaves. The men crowded around, their confident chatter dying in their throats. "What in God's name?" one of them muttered, nudging the ground with his rifle butt. "It's like he flew." Jebediah knelt, his gloved fingers tracing the edge of the last footprint. There were no signs of a struggle, no scuffed earth, no broken branches overhead, no drops of blood. It was a perfect, inexplicable vanishing. The dogs, who had been straining at their leashes moments before, now became a whining, confused pack. They circled the spot, their noses to the ground, their tails tucked low. One of the lead hounds let out a long, mournful howl before backing away, refusing to go any further into that section of the woods. The other dogs followed suit, their earlier eagerness replaced by a palpable fear. Jebediah stood, a prickle of profound unease crawling up his spine. He was a man who trusted two things in this world: his own eyes and his dog's noses. Both were now telling him something that his rational mind refused to accept. He had seen trails washed out by rain, obscured by rock, or lost in water. But he had never seen a trail that just ended, as if the man had been plucked from the earth by an invisible hand. He pushed the feeling aside, forcing a gruff certainty into his voice. "The storm," he declared, more to convince himself than his men. "The rain must have washed the ground clean in this hollow. He's trying to be clever, spread out. We'll circle wide and pick up his scent again on the other side." But as his men moved off, their confidence shaken, Jebediah stared into the dark, silent woods, and the mystery of the vanished trail gnawed at him like a festering wound. Back on the plantation, the day's work continued under the nervous eye of Peters, the temporary overseer. The enslaved people moved with their usual practiced rhythm, their faces impassive masks that betrayed nothing. But beneath the surface of this forced tranquility, a current of complex and dangerous emotions flowed. There was terror, a deep and abiding fear of the collective punishment that was sure to come, the indiscriminate wrath of a master whose authority had been challenged. Every snap of a twig, every distant shout sent a jolt of anxiety through the fields. Yet woven through this fabric of fear was a thread of something else, something wild and exhilarating. It was a fierce, secret pride. Nathan, quiet, watchful Nathan, had done the impossible. He had not just escaped. He had erased the devil himself from the face of the earth and then vanished like a ghost on the wind. In the silent, shared glances between the workers, in the slight, almost imperceptible straightening of a bent back, this pride was a living thing. It was a spark of hope in a world designed to extinguish it. Ilara, the old woman who knew the language of the land, became the quiet center of this unspoken hope. As she sorted herbs on her cabin steps, a subtle, knowing smile played on her lips. Another woman, the mother of the boy Daniel whom Ward had beaten, approached her, her voice a low whisper. "Ilara, what do you think? What's become of him?" Ilara did not look at the woman. Her gaze was fixed on the distant line of the pines, their dark green tops stark against the blue sky. "The woods know how to keep a good man safe," she said, her voice soft but resonant. "And they know how to hold a bad man's secrets." She then began to tell a story, a quiet allegory meant for the ears of those who needed to hear it. She spoke of a clever rabbit hunted relentlessly by a fox. The fox was bigger, faster, and stronger, but the rabbit knew the briar patch better than its own fur. One day, with the fox's breath hot on its tail, the rabbit didn't just run into the briar patch, it became one with it, finding the hidden tunnels and secret hollows that the fox could never navigate. The fox, confused and enraged, saw only a wall of thorns. The rabbit had used the very thing that was meant to imprison it as its sanctuary. The message was clear. Nathan had not simply run into the woods, he had become a part of them, using his deep and patient knowledge of the land to become untouchable. Days bled into a week. The official search was a dismal failure. Jebediah and his men scoured the perimeter of the swamps and the vast expanse of the pinewoods, but they found nothing. Not a footprint, not a broken branch, not a single sign of Nathan Harris. Master Thompson's fury curdled into a bitter, simmering rage, the $200 in gold remaining unclaimed in his safe. The hunters, their initial bravado long gone, grew frustrated and careless. One evening, a young hunter named Finn, tired of the fruitless circling and eager to prove his mettle, broke away from the main group. He was determined to push deeper into a dense, unexplored thicket near the area where the trail had vanished, a place the other men now avoided. As dusk began to settle, the woods grew preternaturally quiet, the air cooling rapidly. The cacophony of insects and birds faded into an expectant hush. Finn pushed his way through a curtain of hanging moss, his rifle at the ready, his senses on high alert. And then he heard it. It was faint, so faint he at first dismissed it as a trick of his own tired mind. A rhythmic metallic sound. Tick-tock, tick-tock. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. The sound was unmistakable. It was the ticking of a pocket watch. His first thought was of Silas Ward. He imagined the overseer injured and delirious, lying in some hidden ditch, waiting to be found. "Ward," he called out, his voice sounding small and thin in the vast silence. "Silas Ward, is that you?" There was no answer. There was only the steady, relentless ticking. He took a cautious step forward, trying to pinpoint the source. But the sound seemed to recede as he approached, a phantom echo that was always just out of reach. He took another step, and the ticking seemed to shift, now coming from his left. He turned, and it seemed to be behind him. A cold, primal fear, the kind he had never known in all his years of hunting, began to grip him. This was not the sound of an injured man. This was something else, something unnatural. The ticking was a cold, mechanical heartbeat in the dying light of the forest. He turned and fled. He ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, vines tearing at his clothes and skin, the sound of his own panicked breathing loud in his ears. He burst back into the hunter's camp, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror, babbling about hearing Ward's ghost, about the ticking watch haunting the pines. The other men, drunk and weary, mocked him mercilessly, laughing at his story. But as Finn sat by the fire, shivering despite the heat, the seed of a new and terrifying legend had been planted in the dark soil of the Georgia woods. The young hunter's story, born of panic and darkness, was at first a source of great amusement. In the smoky confines of the county's taverns, where cheap whiskey flowed and bravado was currency, Finn's tale of a ghostly ticking was met with howls of derisive laughter. Men who wrestled livestock and faced down predators for a living were not inclined to believe in phantoms conjured by a boy's fear. Yet the story refused to die. It clung to the air like the tavern smoke itself, and after the laughter subsided, a thoughtful silence would often fall over the room. The details were too specific, Finn's terror too genuine. The tale spread, carried from the taverns by traveling merchants and itinerant preachers, each telling adding a new, fantastical layer. In some versions, the ticking was accompanied by a spectral light. In others, the sound of Ward's voice calling for help from beneath the earth. The story became a piece of local color, a chilling bit of folklore to be shared around a winter fire. Among the enslaved community of the Thompson plantation and beyond, however, the story that circulated was of an entirely different character. It was not a ghost story whispered in fear, but a tale of power and righteous justice told in tones of hushed reverence. They did not believe Nathan was a ghost. They believed he had become something more. They said he had called upon the spirits of the ancestors, that the great storm itself had been his willing accomplice, an elemental force bent to his will. The ticking that the hunters heard was not the lingering echo of a dead man's soul. It was Nathan's magic, a powerful ward he had placed upon the woods. The watch was not a remnant, but a trophy, a symbol of his victory over the man who had presumed to own his time. The sound was a warning, a clear and present declaration that the pines now belonged to him, and that any who sought to oppress others would find no sanctuary there. This narrative, a potent blend of hope and defiance, became a silent armor for their hearts. Master Thompson, isolated in his great house, heard the whispers of both versions of the tale. He publicly dismissed them as the superstitious ramblings of simpletons and drunks, but privately the stories infuriated him. They were an erosion of his authority, a mockery of his power. The legend of the ticking pines was making him look weak. His plantation seemed cursed, and his control appear fragile. In a desperate attempt to reassert his dominance and crush the burgeoning hope among his workforce, he hired a new overseer, a man named Griggs, whose reputation for brutality was second only to the late Silas Ward's. Griggs arrived with a new set of whips and a cold, dead-eyed stare, but he found the people strangely changed. Their fear, while still present, was now tempered by an unshakable folklore, a shared secret that made them resilient in a way he could not comprehend or break. They would bow their heads in submission, but he could see the story of Nathan reflected in their eyes, a distant, defiant light that his lash could not extinguish. One moonless night, a small group gathered in the deep shadows behind the cabins, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and damp earth. It was a secret meeting, a council of souls desperate for meaning. Among them was Sarah, the mother of the boy Daniel, her face etched with a grief that had hardened into a quiet resolve. They had come to seek the wisdom of Ilara, who sat on a low stool, her presence a pool of calm in the tense darkness. It was Sarah who finally broke the silence, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Ilara, we hear the stories. The white folks talk of ghosts and we talk of magic. Are they true? What really happened to Nathan out there?" Ilara did not answer immediately. She looked up at the sliver of moon visible through the canopy of a live oak, her ancient face a roadmap of sorrows and secrets. When she finally spoke, her voice was as soft as moss, yet it carried the weight of generations. She did not give them a simple answer. Instead, she began to weave a story, her words painting pictures in the darkness. She spoke of the history of those woods, a history that was not written in any book. She told them of the first ones, enslaved men and women from generations past who had escaped the plantations and found refuge in the impenetrable depths of the swamps and pines. They had learned to live with the land, to read its signs, to understand its hidden language. The woods, she explained, had a memory. They remembered the courage of the first ones and had become their sanctuary. "Nathan didn't just run into those woods, child," Ilara said, her gaze finding Sarah's in the gloom. "He was accepted by them. For years I watched him. While other men rested, he listened. He learned the song of the crickets, the whisper of the wind, the paths of the water. He wasn't just looking, he was seeing. He didn't leave a trail because the woods themselves covered his steps, folding him into their secret heart. She leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower, becoming a conspiratorial hum. The ticking they hear? That ain't no ghost. That's the sound of a man's time running out and another man's time just beginning. A collective breath was released among the small group. Ilara's words were a balm, a powerful narrative that transformed their fear and uncertainty into a source of profound strength. Her story elevated Nathan from a desperate fugitive into a mythic figure, a folk hero who had not just escaped his bonds but had seized control of his own destiny and the very land itself. He was no longer just a man who had run, he was a protector, a guardian whose spirit, whether in flesh or in legend, still watched over them from the deep, dark sanctuary of the pines. Weeks later, with the memory of the failed hunt fading and the legend of the ticking pines settling into the realm of campfire tales, two hunters ventured near the now infamous section of the woods. They were practical men, not given to flights of fancy. Amos was a deeply religious farmer who saw the hand of God or the devil in all things, while Bo was a pragmatic blacksmith who believed only in what he could hold and see. They were not looking for ghosts or runaways. They were tracking a large buck, and its trail had led them to the edge of the woods the locals were beginning to call Ward's Folly. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows, they heard it. The sound began just as Finn had described, faint and rhythmic, but this time, the description was not filtered through a boy's panic. It was a clean, precise, metallic sound that cut through the evening air with an unnerving clarity. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was not a woodpecker. It was not an insect. It had a physical quality, a resonant depth that seemed to vibrate not just in the air but in the ground beneath their feet, in the very marrow of their bones. "Dear Lord," Amos whispered, his hand instinctively going to a small cross he wore around his neck. "It's the devil's heartbeat." Bo scoffed, though his eyes were wide with a dawning unease. "Don't be a fool, Amos. It's a sound. Every sound has a source. Let's find it." They pushed forward, their rifles held at the ready, their hunt for the buck forgotten. They moved towards the sound, but it was a phantom lure. It was always just ahead, a maddeningly persistent ghost of a sound. They would take 10 steps and the ticking would seem to be just beyond the next cypress tree. When they reached the tree, the sound would have moved, now seeming to emanate from a dense thicket 50 yards to their right. They circled, they backtracked, they stood perfectly still, trying to triangulate the location, but the ticking defied all logic and reason. It seemed to come from the trees, the ground, and the air itself all at once. It was a cold, relentless, mechanical cadence that seemed to mock their efforts. A sound that belonged to no living thing. The experience began to unravel them. Amos was now muttering prayers under his breath, his face pale with superstitious terror, convinced they were being tempted into damnation. Bo, the pragmatist, was in some ways even more disturbed. His world was governed by physical laws, by cause and effect, and this impossible, mobile, disembodied sound was a violation of everything he knew to be true. It was an acoustic impossibility that chipped away at the foundations of his sanity. They finally abandoned their search as full darkness fell, stumbling out of the woods in a state of profound agitation. Their testimony delivered that night at the tavern from two sober, respected, and deeply shaken men gave the legend a terrifying new credibility. It was no longer a boy's ghost story. It was a verified, inexplicable phenomenon. From that day forward, the area was given a new name, one spoken with a mixture of fear and awe. It was no longer Ward's Folly, it was the Ticking Pines. 6 months passed and the world turned. The suffocating heat of the Georgia summer gave way to a crisp autumn, and then to the stark, quiet chill of winter. On the Thompson plantation, a tense and uneasy stability had taken hold. The new overseer, Griggs, ruled with a predictable, joyless brutality, but the spirit of the place had been irrevocably altered. Silas Ward was now a legal footnote, a man officially declared dead, presumed to have been taken by the swamp or some misadventure in the storm. Nathan Harris, however, had transcended the realm of the living or the dead. He had become a story, a name whispered by children in the dark, a ghost who haunted not the graveyard, but the very idea of freedom. The legend of the Ticking Pines had grown, its roots sinking deep into the local consciousness. It had a tangible effect on the landscape of fear and hope. Fewer hunters and trappers dared to venture into that particular stretch of forest, ceding the territory to its unseen rhythmic guardian. More importantly, the story had become a beacon. On 2 separate occasions, enslaved families from neighboring plantations had made a desperate run for freedom, and their path was not north but west, straight towards the woods that no one would follow them into. The legend of Nathan had become a stop on a railroad that was not made of iron but of courage and whispers. It was in the refined, gaslit parlors of Savannah, far from the mud and superstition of the countryside, that the story was received with amused skepticism. Here, among men of commerce and education, it was seen as a quaint, if absurd, piece of rural folklore. Mr. Alistair Finch, a wealthy landowner and a proud member of a local philosophical society, found the tale particularly galling. He was a man of science and unwavering reason, a believer in empirical evidence and logical deduction. To him, the world was a grand, intricate clockwork, and every mystery was simply a gear whose function had not yet been properly observed. One evening, swirling a glass of brandy at his club, he held forth on the subject. "A ticking ghost?" he scoffed, his voice carrying across the room. "It is an insult to the modern intellect. The explanation is undoubtedly biological. There is likely a species of tree frog, or perhaps a boring beetle, whose mating call, when amplified by the unique acoustics of a hollow or dense canopy, mimics a mechanical sound. It is a simple matter of acoustics and animal mimicry." An older gentleman, a cotton merchant named Davies, chuckled. "Be that as it may, Alistair, men I trust have come out of those woods white as a sheet, swearing it was Ward's watch they heard. They say the sound moves." Finch waved a dismissive hand. "Fear is a powerful hallucinogen. I am so certain of my hypothesis that I will wager $500 on it. I shall personally lead an expedition into these so-called ticking pines. I will identify the creature responsible, and I will bring back a specimen, thus putting an end to this ridiculous myth once and for all." The wager was accepted with boisterous enthusiasm. The men in the room eager to see the arrogant Finch either prove his point or be humbled by the very superstition he so disdained. Finch, true to his word, began to assemble his expedition of reason. He secured the services of a quiet, bespectacled naturalist from Charleston, a man named Elias Thorne, who was intrigued by the possibility of discovering a new species. For his guide, Finch knew he needed someone who knew the terrain intimately, someone who had been there at the very beginning. His inquiries led him to a small, run-down farmstead and to Jebediah. The tracker was not the man he had been 6 months ago. The confident, swaggering hunter was gone, replaced by a gaunt, haunted figure whose eyes seemed to be perpetually fixed on some distant, unpleasant memory. The failure to find Nathan, the inexplicable vanishing of the trail, and the subsequent terrifying stories had gnawed away at his certainty, leaving behind a grudging respect for the unknown. He initially refused Finch's offer flatly. "I ain't going back in there," he said, his voice low and raspy. "That place ain't right." Finch, however, was persistent. He laid out a handsome sum of money, but it was his appeal to Jebediah's wounded pride that finally broke the man's resolve. "They say you were bested, Jebediah," Finch said smoothly. "That the woods themselves outsmarted you. This is your chance to find the truth, to solve the very mystery that has become a stain on your reputation." Jebediah's jaw tightened. He looked at his fallow fields, at his worn, calloused hands, and then at the distant line of the pines. He agreed, not for the money and not for Finch, but to confront the failure that had been haunting his waking and sleeping hours. The expedition set off on a cold, clear morning in late January. The winter woods were a world of stark, silent beauty. The branches of the oaks and hickories were bare, skeletal fingers clawing at a pale, indifferent sky. The air was so still that the snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot. Finch was in high spirits, his voice booming in the quiet as he pointed out various species of birds and offered condescending explanations for the strange shapes of the trees. Thorne, the naturalist, was more reserved, his eyes scanning the forest floor, occasionally stooping to examine a patch of moss or a peculiar fungus. Jebediah walked ahead of them, his rifle cradled in his arms, his earlier bravado replaced by a grim, watchful silence. He felt the woods pressing in on him, the silence not empty but full of a waiting presence. As they drew closer to the area, he paused, turning to Finch. "Some things ain't meant to be explained, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're just meant to be." Finch let out a short, barking laugh. "Nonsense, my good man. Everything in God's creation has an explanation. We simply need the tools and the intellect to find it. There are no ghosts here, only ignorance, and we are here to banish it." Jebediah said nothing more, simply turning and continuing his grim march into the heart of the woods. They found the place without difficulty, the small, unremarkable hollow where the trail had vanished months before. It was unchanged, a quiet, shaded area where the pine straw lay thick and undisturbed. As Finch looked around, smugly pointing out how ordinary it all was, Thorne, the naturalist, knelt by the base of a large cypress. "Extraordinary," he murmured, pulling a magnifying glass from his waistcoat. Growing in a near-perfect circle around the base of several trees was a species of fungus he had never encountered. It was a pale, almost luminous white with delicate web-like structures connecting each mushroom. I can't identify this. The mycelial network is arranged in a pattern I've never seen documented in this region. Finch glanced at it dismissively. A local variant, no doubt. Interesting but irrelevant to our primary purpose. Jebediah, meanwhile, had been trying to coax his dog, a lean blue-tick hound named Blue, into the thicket. He had brought the dog specifically for this purpose, to see if it would react as his other dogs had. As they reached the edge of the dense undergrowth, Blue, who had been trotting happily ahead, suddenly stopped. The fur on his neck bristled. He let out a low, guttural whine, planting his feet firmly on the ground and refusing to move an inch further. He looked up at Jebediah, his eyes wide with an animal terror. "You see," Jebediah said quietly to Finch. "Just like before." Finch frowned, his confidence momentarily pricked. "The animal is poorly trained, Jebediah. It's merely spooked by the cold or the scent of a fox." As dusk began its rapid descent, the woods fell into a profound and unnerving silence. The temperature dropped, and the men's breath plumed in the frigid air. It was in this deep hush that they heard it. The sound began faintly, a distant rhythmic beat that was almost imperceptible. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Finch's face lit up with triumph. "There!" he exclaimed, his voice a loud whisper. "You hear it? A woodpecker, I'd wager. A black-backed, perhaps, or even a pileated, though we are far south for their typical range." He raised his field glasses, scanning the darkening canopy. But the sound did not stop. It did not have the organic, slightly irregular pattern of a bird's pecking. It was a cold, precise, and unnervingly steady beat. It grew louder, more defined, the unmistakable cadence of a pocket watch. The sound was metallic, resonant, and it seemed to have no single point of origin. It was simply there, in the air around them, a disembodied heartbeat in the twilight. Thorne's hand began to shake so badly that he dropped the pencil he was using to sketch the strange fungi. Finch's rational explanations became more frantic, his voice losing its confident timbre. "It's an acoustic illusion," he insisted, his eyes darting nervously into the shadows. "The cold, dense air is carrying the sound in a peculiar way, creating an echo that seems to come from multiple directions." But the sound grew louder still, a cold, mechanical, relentless rhythm that seemed to mock his scientific certainty. It surrounded them, a phantom clock measuring out the seconds in the heart of the darkening woods. Jebediah stood frozen, his face a pale mask in the gloom. He gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles were white. He had heard this sound in his nightmares for 6 months, and he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that this was not the sound of any bird or beast that walked the earth. A sudden, unseasonable fog rolled in, a silent white tide that swallowed the stark winter landscape. It did not drift in from the horizon, it seemed to rise from the ground itself, a cold, damp exhalation from the earth. Within minutes, the world was reduced to a claustrophobic circle of gray, no more than 10 feet in any direction. Their lanterns, which had seemed so bright and reassuring just moments before, now became feeble, sickly glows, casting their own light back at them and creating a disorienting wall of white. The fog played tricks with the light, twisting the bare branches of the trees into the shapes of grasping claws and hunched, monstrous figures that danced at the edge of their vision. The ticking was now constant, a maddeningly persistent heartbeat in the thick, muffling silence. It was no longer just a sound they heard with their ears. It had become a physical sensation, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to get inside their heads, resonating in their teeth and bones. It was the sound of a clock in a sealed room, inescapable and absolute. Terror began to systematically dismantle them, each man according to his own nature. Finch, the man of pure, unassailable reason, was the first to truly break. His scientific certainty, having no purchase on the impossible reality confronting him, shattered into 1,000 pieces of raw panic. His eyes, wide and wild, darted into the swirling fog. "Did you see that?" he hissed, grabbing Thorne's arm with a hand that trembled violently. A figure, tall. It moved right there between the trees. He was seeing things now, his mind desperately trying to give a shape to the source of his fear, and in doing so, conjuring horrors from the shifting vapors. The naturalist, Thorne, had succumbed to a different kind of madness. He had clapped his hands over his ears. His body curled into a tight ball on the damp ground. He was rocking back and forth, his spectacles askew, muttering incoherently. "It's inside," he sobbed, his voice muffled by his hands. "It's burrowing into my skull. I can feel it turning." The sound for him was not an external phenomenon, it was a physical violation, an auditory parasite that had breached the walls of his sanity. Jebediah was the only one who remained standing, though his composure was a thin, brittle shell over a core of primal dread. His hunter's instincts, honed over a lifetime of reading the subtle language of the wild, were screaming at him. This was not a random haunting. This was a controlled and intelligent act. They were being herded, played with like mice in a maze constructed by a cruel and patient god. He could feel a presence in the fog, a cold, calculating intelligence that was watching them, enjoying their descent into madness. Their conversation, when it came, was a fragmented, panicked mess, the last gasps of reason drowning in a sea of fear. "It's a trick of the mind," Finch babbled, his voice high and strained. "The fog, the pressure, the cold. It's creating an auditory illusion." Thorne let out a thin shriek. "Illusion? It's inside my head. I can feel it." Jebediah's voice cut through their hysteria, a low, guttural command. "Quiet! Both of you, you're spooking it!" Finch spun on him, his face a mask of disbelief. "Spooking it? Spooking what? A cricket? A beetle?" Jebediah's gaze did not waver from the impenetrable wall of white that surrounded them. "No, sir," he said, his voice heavy with a terrible certainty. "I'm not a cricket." At that moment, the ticking, which had been a constant surrounding pressure, suddenly changed. It grew impossibly loud, deafeningly so, as if 1,000 clocks were all striking midnight at once right beside their ears. The sound was so intense it was physically painful, a concussive force that made them stagger and cry out, and in that instant of overwhelming sound a flash of brilliant blue-white light erupted from the fog-shrouded sky. It was not lightning, it was too cold, too silent, but it bleached the world white for a single eternal second. In that flash of unnatural illumination they saw it. Hanging from a low, gnarled branch of an ancient cypress tree, a tree so large it seemed to hold up the sky, was the shape of a man. It was not Nathan. It was not Silas. It was a crude, terrifying effigy. a man-shaped figure woven from thick vines, dried moss, and dark, twisted roots. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, its head a lopsided ball of Spanish moss from which two dark stones stared out like dead eyes. And from the center of the figure's chest, from the very spot where a human heart would be, came the deafening, soul-shattering ticking. The light caught the glint of something metallic half buried in the woven vines of its chest, the source of the sound, the heart of the mystery. The vision, in its grotesque and impossible reality, was the final blow. It shattered what little remained of their courage, their reason, their very sense of self. It was a horror that transcended ghosts or spirits. It was a deliberate, crafted, and malevolent thing. A scream tore from Thorne's throat, a raw, animal sound of pure terror. Finch made a choked, gurgling noise, his eyes rolling back in his head. The spell of their paralysis broke, and they were consumed by a single, overwhelming instinct: flight. They ran blindly with no thought to direction, no care for the branches that whipped their faces or the roots that snagged their feet. They stumbled, fell, scrambled back up, and ran again, driven by a panic so profound it erased all other thought. They were no longer men of science or skill. They were just creatures fleeing a predator they could not comprehend. Their own screams mixing with the phantom ticking that still echoed in their minds. They crashed through the underbrush, their lanterns abandoned, their reason left behind with the terrible ticking effigy hanging in the heart of the fog. They burst out of the woods at dawn, miles from where they had entered, on the far side of the swamp. They did not emerge. They were expelled, spat out onto the edge of a frosty pasture like indigestible things. A farmer on his way to milk his cows in the gray morning light stopped dead in his tracks, his milk pail clattering to the frozen ground. The three men were a shocking sight. Their fine coats were shredded, their faces and hands were crisscrossed with deep, bleeding scratches, and they were covered from head to toe in mud and filth. But it was their eyes that truly horrified the farmer. They were the eyes of men who had stared into the abyss and had seen it stare back. Finch, the proud, arrogant gentleman, was a changed man. His arrogance was gone, burned away by the terror of the night, replaced by a haunted, vacant look. He stumbled back to Savannah, paid the $500 wager without a single word of explanation, and resigned from his philosophical society. He sold his townhouse and retreated to a small, isolated estate upriver, where he lived out the rest of his days as a recluse, never again speaking of science, reason, or the things that lurked in the dark woods of Chatham County. The naturalist Elias Thorne was not so fortunate. The experience had shattered his delicate mind completely. He was committed to an asylum in Charleston, where he spent his days tracing patterns on the walls and muttering about a sound that was burrowing into his brain. Jebediah was the only one who talked. He returned to the tavern, his face aged 10 years in a single night, and sat at a corner table, a bottle of whiskey untouched before him. The patrons, seeing his state, gathered around, their earlier mockery replaced by a fearful curiosity. They asked him what he had seen, if he had found the source of the ticking. Jebediah took a long, slow breath, the horrors of the night replaying behind his eyes. He knew he could never speak of the effigy of the man made of moss and vines. They would not believe him, they would call him mad, and the truth was too terrible, too sacred in its horror to be sullied by disbelief. So he gave them a different kind of truth, a truth they could understand, and more importantly, a truth they would heed. He looked up, his faded denim eyes meeting theirs, and they saw in them a chilling, absolute certainty. "Something's in there," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper that carried to every corner of the silent room. "And it keeps its own time. It ain't for us to meddle with." His testimony, coming from the most respected and fearless hunter in the region, was more powerful than any ghost story. It turned the legend of the ticking pines into accepted, unassailable fact. The mystery was not solved, it was consecrated. The woods were no longer just haunted, they were protected. Years passed and the seasons turned over the land, each one wearing away a little more of the Thompson plantation's prosperity and a great deal more of its master's authority. The coming storm of civil war was a distant rumble on the horizon, but a more immediate and corrosive force was at work in Chatham County. The ticking pines had become a wound in the map of Master Thompson's world, a territory he no longer controlled. His fortune, built on the absolute dominion over land and the people who worked it, was bleeding away. He had lost more than a dozen enslaved people in the intervening years, not to the distant promise of the North, but to the immediate, tangible hope offered by the woods to the west. They fled towards the legend, a place no overseer in his right mind would enter, and a place where tracking dogs, as everyone now knew, were useless. The story of Nathan Harris had become a vital artery on the Underground Railroad, a whispered password that meant both sanctuary and defiance. It was a story told in the dead of night to give courage to those about to risk everything for a life they could barely imagine. On a humid evening, as fireflies began to stitch the twilight with cold green light, a young boy sat on the steps of a cabin, his eyes fixed on the dark, forbidding wall of the forest. He was born years after the disappearance, a child of the new era of uneasy quiet and simmering hope. He turned to his mother, who was mending a shirt in the fading light. "Mama," he asked, his voice small, "why can't we go in those woods?" His mother, who had been a young girl herself when Nathan vanished, paused her work. She looked at the pines, and her expression was not one of fear, but of a deep and mysterious reverence. She began to tell him the story, but the version she told had evolved, polished by years of secret repetition into a gleaming testament of hope. In her telling, Nathan was not a ghost who haunted the woods. He was a living man, a king. He was the founder of a hidden community of runaways who lived deep within the impenetrable sanctuary of the swamp, a place they called the Free Territory. They had built a life there, a world of their own, protected by the watchful spirit of the woods and the cleverness of their leader. And the ticking watch, she explained, was not a curse, it was their signal. It was the intricate work of Nathan the Maker, a system of hidden wires and sounding boxes that carried the rhythmic beat for miles. The ticking was the heartbeat of their freedom, a signal that let them know when it was safe to send guides to the edge of the woods to help other souls like them cross over from the world of bondage into the land of the living. Ilara was now an ancient woman, her body frail and bent, but her eyes, looking out from a face as wrinkled and wise as the bark of a century-old oak, had lost none of their fire. She was the keeper of the flame, the living library of the community's history and its hope. She sat on the small porch of her cabin, her gnarled hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the pines she had been watching for a lifetime. That night she received a visitor. A young woman named Hattie, her face a mask of terror and determination, slipped from the shadows and knelt at Ilara's feet. Hattie was planning to run that very night to follow the story into the woods, and her fear was a living thing, a cold weight in her chest. "Auntie Ilara," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm going, but I'm so afraid. Tell me the truth. What really happened to Nathan? Did he kill that man? Is he a spirit like some say, or is he waiting like the stories tell?" Ilara looked down at the young, frightened face, and a slow, gentle smile touched her lips. She reached out and took Hattie's trembling hand, her own skin as dry and thin as parchment. "What happened?" Ilara said, her voice a low, soothing hum. "Was a man decided he was worth more than the price on his back. He looked at the watch in the overseer's hand and decided to take back his own time. The story is the path, child. You don't need to know the truth of the man, you just need to trust the truth of the story. You follow that sound and it will lead you to freedom. Whether Nathan is a man or a spirit, he is waiting for you. He made the path. Now you must have the courage to walk it." Hattie squeezed her hand, tears of gratitude and fear welling in her eyes, and then she was gone, a fleeting shadow melting back into the night. Ilara remained on her porch, her gaze once again on the distant trees. Her words to Hattie were the truest thing she knew, but her own memories held a different, sharper kind of truth, a secret she would carry to her grave. She remembered Nathan not as a myth, but as a boy, a quiet, watchful boy who was endlessly fascinated by the inner workings of things. She remembered him taking apart a broken music box and patiently putting it back together again. She remembered his hands, clever and nimble, as he fashioned intricate traps and snares that could catch a rabbit without even breaking its skin. He was a master of leverage and tension, of weights and counterweights. He understood the physics of the world in a way no one else did. And as she sat there, the image of the effigy that Jebediah had described in his whiskey-fueled ramblings years ago, a story he told only once and then denied forever, rose in her mind. She could see it clearly, a thing of vines and moss, and she could see Nathan's hands building it. She could imagine him, in the heart of the storm's chaos, not killing Silas Ward, but disarming him, terrifying him, and then using his own symbol of power against him. She could picture Nathan, a genius of the wilderness, stringing vines like clockwork, using the weight of a stone and the slow release of water to create a simple, ticking mechanism. She could imagine him finding the perfect hollow, the natural amphitheater in the woods that would amplify that tiny sound into a disembodied, omnipresent heartbeat. He had not used violence, he had used fear. He had waged a war not on a man's body but on his mind, and on the minds of all who would follow. He had crafted a weapon of psychological warfare from a stolen watch and the superstitions of his oppressors. But Ilara knew with a wisdom that went deeper than memory that this truth, the cleverness of one man, was a fragile thing. The legend, the story of the spirit king and the promise of a hidden kingdom, that was what had the power to free a people. The legend was the better, more useful truth. Hattie ran. She ran with Alara's words burning in her heart, a talisman against the fear that clawed at her. She moved through the familiar fields, now rendered strange and hostile in the darkness, her bare feet making no sound on the soft earth. She reached the edge of the ticking pines as the first hint of dawn was beginning to pale the eastern sky. She stood there, her breath catching in her throat, the stories and the warnings of a lifetime crashing down on her. The trees stood as a solid wall of blackness, silent and imposing. For a moment her courage faltered, and then, as she took a hesitant step into the deep shadows, she heard it. It was faint, a delicate and steady rhythm carried on the cool morning air. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was not frightening. It was not a ghostly echo or a devil's heartbeat. It was a promise. It was the sound of a path opening up, a steady, mechanical hand reaching out to her from the darkness. A sob of relief and gratitude escaped her lips, and she plunged forward into the woods, her fear gone, replaced by a profound and unshakable faith in the story. The narrative pulls back, ascending from the running woman, from the ancient woods, from the struggling plantation, until the entire landscape is a tapestry of green and brown. The story of Nathan Harris and the ticking watch became a permanent fixture of that tapestry, a thread of dark mystery and bright hope woven deep into the folklore of the region. Even after the Great War came and went, after the last chains fell and the word emancipation was spoken aloud in the fields, the story was told. It was told by parents to their children to teach them about courage. It was told by old men in taverns to remind them of the strange and unknowable nature of the world. Some say the ticking finally stopped on the day the last enslaved person in Georgia was freed. That Nathan's purpose was fulfilled and his spirit or his mechanism finally fell silent. But others, the ones who live near the woods and know its secrets, swear that on the quietest of nights, when the moon is a sliver and the wind is still, if you stand at the edge of the old pine woods and listen with your heart instead of your ears, you can still hear it. A faint, ghostly, and impossibly steady ticking. It is a reminder of a man who vanished into a story, a slave who took back his time and left nothing behind but a sound. A sound that became a legend, and a legend that became an eternal promise of freedom. The mystery of what truly happened to Nathan Harris and Silas Ward was never solved by the world of men, but the power of what Nathan created, the path he opened with a sound, was eternal.